We begin today with the latest in Ukraine. Over the past couple of weeks, the conflict in the country has shifted from Kiev to Crimea, a region located on the northern coast of the Black Sea. As geopolitical tensions continue to rise, lawmakers voted today to hold a referendum on whether the region should become a part of Russia. To get some reaction to that, earlier I spoke with RT's Maria Fanoshina, who's on the ground in Crimea.
Well, indeed, on Thursday, Crimea's parliament voted to join Russia. It is a historic decision. This vast area that used to be part of the Russian Empire and till today has very strong ties with its big neighbor, with more than half of its population being Russians and with the Russian language being spoken here everywhere by the absolute majority of locals. Well, this could become part of Russia again. It's now up to local people to decide the republic's future. The referendum over Crimea's status is expected to be held in 10 days on March the 16th. In fact, it was initially scheduled for May, and then it was moved to the end of March, and we asked local authorities today why they are in such a rush, and we spoke to Crimea's Prime Minister, Mr. Aksyonov, and he told us that first of all they are in such a rush because what is going on in Kiev and how things are developing there, he said, they take as a threat to peace here in the region. They say they don't recognize the authorities in Kiev, they don't recognize these new masters as a legitimate power, and they are afraid that they want to come here and to repeat what happened in Kiev here in the Crimea, and they obviously don't want this to happen here because those events were very bloody and hectic, so they don't want to see it here on their territory, and this is why they're worried a lot, and this is why they are feeling under a big pressure. And especially he emphasized that they are worrying about so-called radical elements, some nationalist, ultra-nationalist elements that are representing the Ukraine's new authorities today. We know that altogether 4 ministries in Ukraine's interim government are run by the representatives of ultra-nationalist party, and local authorities here in the Crimea say they don't want this to happen here on their territory, and this is another reason why they are in the rush to organize this referendum over Crimea's status. And another reason, they say, is that people, local residents, are pushing them for this move because you have to understand it's been a tough time for all Ukrainians, including Crimeans. The events that have been happening here in the last 3 months have been very tough and very bloody, and no one expected something like this to happen here in Ukraine. And this is why people feel this uncertainty, and maybe this referendum could calm them down a little bit, and this is why they are asking local authorities to organize this as soon as possible.
And Maria, there's likely a very different response on the ground in Kiev. What have you gathered about the reaction there to this referendum?
Well, this is a mirror situation. Crimea's authorities don't recognize Kiev's new masters. They don't see it as legitimate power. And at the same time, Kiev's authorities don't recognize don't recognize authorities here in the Crimea. They call them illegitimate power. And recently, they issued warrant arrest for Crimea's Prime Minister, Mr. Aksyonov. Of course, what kind of reaction can we expect from Kiev? We asked this question, Mr. Aksyonov, today, and he told us that all they expect is hysteria and anger from Kiev, because, of course, this is something that Kiev don't want to see local authorities to do. And we heard already even earlier that, speaking about this referendum, Kiev's authorities don't recognize this referendum as legitimate. So certainly we're going to see more tensions in the coming days, and this is why we heard from local authorities that security is tightening up these days because they expect some provocations and maybe even some aggressions because of their decision to hold this referendum soon.
And Maria, what kind of Russian military presence are you seeing in Crimea right now?
Well, Russia has a naval base here in the Crimea, and according to an agreement signed between Russia and Ukrainian side back in 1997, it is allowed more than around 25,000 troops here on the Crimean territory. According to this agreement, more than 20 military planes, more than 130 armored vehicles and artillery. And this is all the Russian military presence that we can see here on the peninsula. But all their movements are restricted by this agreement and always coordinated with the Ukrainian side. But of course, we are familiar with reports that there are some extra Russian troops cross the Ukrainian-Russian border, and there are some extra Russian military equipment here on the territory. We can't confirm this information. It's very hard to verify. But what we hear from both Russian officials and from the Crimean officials is that there is no any extra Russian military presence here these days. But what we can see is that the security here on the peninsula is these days provided mostly by, of course, regional police, but mostly by so-called self-defense forces. And initially it was made up of mostly civil locals, but later we saw Cossacks troops joining these forces as well, and some former military and some, for example, former Afghan veterans. And we're also hearing from local authorities that volunteers from Russia joining these self-defense forces here to help locals protect their territory. And today, when we talked to Crimea's Prime Minister, I asked him this question: who are all these people? Because the most confusing thing about these self-defense squads is that they're wearing quite fashionable uniform, and they're equipped with good weapons. And he told us that he controls these forces personally, and yes, they have uniform, and they provide all those who want to join these forces with this uniform. And he also told us that they now have 2,000 more complex of this uniform, and they're ready to provide it with to give it to anyone who will be willing to join these forces in the future.
Well, thank you for that reporting, Maria Fanoshina, on the ground in Crimea. Thank you.